Good evening, welcome to this Liberal Reform event. My name is Nick Thornsby, I'm a board member of Liberal Reform. This event is titled What Should the Government Stop Doing? I'm not sure if that came across slightly ambiguously to any of you, but the proposal is firmly that we thought as a group that as Liberals we don't often look at the state and think about it in the round and think about whether the state we have inherited as our party of government is the sort of state that we want to see, and too often proceed on the assumption that everything that Labour decided to do in the run-up to 2010 was everything that we would want to do, and then only tinker around with it in government. The consequence of that is that when we run a large deficit, as we have been doing, and fiscal consolidation is necessary, that we simply cut departmental budgets across the board and cut the welfare bill by a certain percentage without really thinking whether there are any big areas of government spending that as Liberals we could do without altogether in order to protect some of those departments and welfare spending that we most value. So we've got an esteemed panel here to tell us what they would stop doing altogether. I don't know if anybody's got a calculator to keep a running total, but we may have abolished the deficit by the time we finished in an hour or so that would be quite an achievement. Our panel, to the speaking arrangements are entirely coincidental, but to my far right is Tom Papworth, who is an economist at the Centre Forum think tank and also is a board member of Liberal Reform. Baroness Julie Smith is a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords and a Cambridge City Councillor and a senior lecturer in the Department for Politics and International Studies at Cambridge. Tim Farron, also coincidentally to my left.
But you're right, so work that one out.
Yes. It was until recently, of course, party president, MP for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, and he's now the party's spokesman on foreign affairs. And Baroness Kishwer Falkner, also a member of the House of Lords, where she chairs the Parliamentary Policy Committee on Foreign Affairs. She's also a Chancellor of Northampton University, among other things. So we'll kick off with 5 minutes or so from each speaker. They can get their red pens out, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So hopefully you can have a think about some ideas, and you can put them to our panel a little later on. So Tom's going to kick us off, and we'll see if there's any government left by the end of her speech.
I did think of starting this speech by saying that the government should stop and then just sit down, but that would probably be too radical even for this audience. But thanks very much, Nick. I think before we start, we should remind ourselves of the hole we're in. We still face, or we will next year face, a £76 billion deficit. And though the Liberal Democrats are only trying to close the structural deficit and they're only targeting non-investment spending, that's still a £50 billion hole, of which, because economists tell us that the fiscal consolidations that are the most effective, that last the longest, that achieve recovery quickest, are those where 80% of the saving is done through cuts and only 20% is done by tax rises, means that if we're wise, we're looking for £40 billion more of government savings. Now, when faced with a £150 billion hole, courtesy of the Labour government in 2010, the government did what every government does, which is it salami-sliced all the departments. Just when everyone's got to take a little bit of a share, and as a consequence, every department had to go around and find some more savings. That's the first thing I'd stop. We need to stop salami-slicing departments and start zero-based accounting government. We need to start from the bottom up and say, what do we need to do and what do we not need to do? We should take every single policy, every single department, every single line of spending and say, do we need to be doing this? So, for example, do we really need to be spending £1/3 billion on art subsidies? There is no market failure in the arts. Having worked at the Arts Council for England for a brief and not particularly pleasant time, I was struck in particular by the £50 million a year subsidy to the Royal Opera House that was desperately trying to help those poor, well-heeled middle-class people who like the opera keep their tickets slightly cheaper. So yes, I'd start by scrapping all government arts funding. I don't think it serves any purpose at all. And it certainly makes no sense to be borrowing £1/3 billion a year so that we can all enjoy the theatre. However, £1/3 billion is small beer. It's hardly worth getting out of bed for. So let's look at some real savings. Let's turn to pensions. The government spends £38 billion a year on pension tax relief, basically giving you some of your money back when you put it into a pension. Tax relief takes place at the margin, which means what you get back is the highest rate of tax you're paying, as a consequence of which the top rate taxpayer gets 40p in the pound back. Most of you probably only get 20p in the pound back. So I'd abolish pension tax relief, we don't need that. I'd replace it with a flat rate 25% contribution from the government. We will put in £1 for every £4 you put in your pension. That means if you're on the minimum wage, and thanks to this government, you don't pay any tax, for the first time you're actually getting some money in your pension, whereas at the moment you don't get any pension tax relief. If you decide you want to put £100,000 into your pension, we won't be meeting that at a rate of 40p. That would be absurd. How much does this save? £13 billion is how much it saves by not giving the highest earners in our country twice the pension tax relief that we give the poorest. And now I've softened you up with a nice big tax cut, I'm going to say something slightly less likely to be popular, which is, well, we're looking at 11-figure sums of money. I think we need to revisit our overseas aid budget. Ooh. Now, I know we have just set it in law, and I do totally understand the desire to help the poorest people in the world. I've got two reasons for concern about this. The first is we don't pay it. At the moment, we're borrowing the money to give to pay on aid, to spend on aid. So actually, our children are paying it. And what's more, because anything that's any line of tax could be used to raise the personal allowance, it is the poorest taxpayers in 25 years' time who will be paying for our current transfers of aid. Which still kind of might make sense if there was any evidence that aid did a lot of good. However, as Bill Easterly, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has conclusively proven, overseas aid and development does not in any way translate into increased growth in poor countries. It just isn't achieving the objective we think it's achieving. So as a consequence, what we may be doing is borrowing money off our children in 25 years' time to make ourselves feel better by paying for a policy that doesn't really do anything. So I would at least say ring-fencing the department and setting a 0.7% target is probably not the right way forward, especially because that 0.7% target means that DFID is now in that wonderfully unique situation of being the only government department that is judged purely on its ability to spend money. That is not a good way to run the country. The last one, and then I will sit down, the last one actually doesn't save the government very much money at all. But it might help us grow our economy and build those 300,000 houses we wanted, which is I would basically stop the government stopping so many planning applications, so much development. We are never going to have affordable housing in this country. We are never going to have the 300,000 homes that we have agreed to target if we continue with the planning regulations that we have at the moment. And if, perchance, by scrapping some of those planning regulations, we could get to 300,000 homes a year, we would, by coincidence, create 750,000 jobs and probably add at least 1% to our growth rate every year. So there's a little bit of something. I think it probably adds up to about 30 billion, which is most of the way to fiscal consolidation. I'm sure Julie can fill in the rest.
Thank you, Tom, and our panellists will be breathing a sigh of relief because nothing they can now say will be controversial. So, Julie, over to you.
Believe me, I'm planning to say something even more controversial because the 0.7 is actually only a small percent of our gross national expenditure. But I'm going to take a step back first because I rather stupidly, earlier in the week, agreed to speak at this fringe meeting. And then I stopped and looked at the exam question again and thought, this was a bit of a mistake. Why did I agree to do it? And at that point, Tim was on the panel and Tom was on the panel. I thought, well, Tim's probably quite on the left of the party, not quite sure where Tom's going to be, but I can be somewhere else, and I might talk a bit about foreign policy and so on. And then I saw that Kishwer was on the panel as well when the final programme came out, and I thought, well, There's a danger that quite often when we're in the House of Lords, we agree on things, including on foreign policy. So there was a bit of a danger that we might be saying similar things. So I thought, well, I better go and do some homework. I better find out what the government spends money on, because obviously we know some of the expenditure. We know the 0.7% of GNI because that's the big flagship for overseas aid. We know that we spend a lot on welfare and the health service, and that some people want to continue spending 2% on defence, and some people don't. So I went to the internet and decided I would look up the Treasury figures. It was that or the Public Accounts Committee. And I thought, well, I could look to see what Margaret Hodge was harping on about, but maybe she'd be being too nasty to cope with. So I went to the Treasury website. And the first thing I found was something on government spending. So I clicked onto that, and then it said hospitality. So I thought, well, that's clearly something that needs to go. You know, if HMRC is wasting money on hospitality, get rid of that. So I clicked onto it and discovered that it wasn't actually HMRC giving hospitality. It was a register of interests and of hospitality received. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just see what people are up to and what sort of gratuitous luxury they're enjoying. And I scrolled down, went past the name of Lynn Homer and so on. And then I got down to the name of William Hague. I thought, well, hang on, he doesn't work for HMRC.
You're going to abolish William Hague?
Well, I'm proposing to abolish William Hague
himself.
because I discovered on the HMRC list of people on the Register of Interests was one William Hague, but he is called the Chief People Officer. He had a nil record on his register. Whether this is the Right Honourable William Hague being double-hatted and having a second job. If it is, then I definitely want him abolished. But otherwise, I'm not quite sure why HMRC has a Chief People Officer. But he doesn't appear to cost us too much in terms of hospitality. But I then thought, well, being a little bit more serious, I would go down and find out what it really is the expenditure. And then I came to another icon that said MPs' expenses. Well, that sounds like another area where people would like some cuts. And I apologise, there was nothing about peers' allowances, otherwise I would mention that as well. So obviously abolishing the House of Lords would be one way of keeping us saving. But there is a whole little bespoke box on the HMRC's website for MPs to appeal against a decision on their expense claim, if you're a Member of Parliament or a former MP. So HMRC is obviously concerned about hospitality and expenses. But more seriously, what are we spending money on and why are we doing it? I gather from the website of one of the websites, we're spending between 42 and 48% of GDP on government expenditure and have done pretty well ever since the end of the Second World War. But in 53-54, according to the IFS, we were spending 22.1% of our expenditure was going on defence, 12.2% on social security, and 7% on debt. Now we're spending 29% on social security, only 5% on debt. So debt's a bit lower than it was 60 years ago, and defence is a tenth of what it was then, and people would like to cut that further. And that, to me, is a problem, because for me, the fundamental role of the state is defence of the realm. And there is a limit to how far I would want to cut defence. So that's one thing that I wouldn't cut. But I think there is a question about what we think the role of the state is, because over the years it's become more and more significant, and the balance of expenditure has changed fundamentally. There are then a couple of things that are going to be very controversial, but I will say them, not because I'm saying they should be cut. So in fact, I'm not helping the bottom line at all, because I'm simply throwing these things out. But does it make sense for the state to be funding childcare? What are we doing with that? How far should we be contributing to early years? We've all just committed to that sort of policy through the policy process here at conference. Is it something we should be doing? Is that something that the state should be providing? Might be, but that is a policy choice. And unless we want fundamentally to change what we do as the state in the UK, then it's quite difficult to see where you make cuts. That if you're in the US, your taxes would be lower, spending would be lower, and your quality of life would be infinitely lower. If you were in Sweden, the reverse would be true. And so it's really a question of, if we want to live in a modern welfare state, there's very little that you could cut without causing major concern. And so if I said, let's take a step back and not fund childcare, I suspect there would be outroar, and I would probably be hauled into the Chief Whip's office and asked, why are you not supporting party policy? So I'm not suggesting we should get rid of that, but it's an area of significant expenditure. Somebody else suggested we could get rid of the triple lock on pensions. That would be a bit of a saving. And certainly there are a lot of areas associated with pensioners where we are privileging the middle and upper class pensioners, and I think there are areas there that could be cut. More strategically, I think if we're not really going to change the sort of state we want to have, what we should be doing is being more strategic about what we do. So if you're doing major infrastructure projects, you don't do the rail and the roads and the airports entirely separately. Think about things strategically, because at the moment we have far too many major infrastructure projects that are never joined up. So there are ways, I think, of saving money and increasing efficiency. That would hopefully be helpful. Somebody else suggested, think about agency workers. Far too many people in the health service and elsewhere are agency workers. It's not necessarily good for them. It's not good for the economy. Let's look at ways of changing the appointment system. So I think changing infrastructure, changing agency workers, and then looking at procurement. And that will be true in defence, all the infrastructure area, schools, health service, lots of ways where you could change how we do things. And I would actually go back and do some serious zero-based budgeting to see how we put those things back together. But I'm not persuaded that it's really going to be popular to stop doing anything at all. And I think I might defend the arts as well as defending the defence budget. So if we want to change the sort of country we are, we can stop major big-ticket items. But if we want to stay the sort of Western liberal democracy that has evolved over the last 60 years, then I don't think the government should stop doing very much at all.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'm just looking around the room now to see if any of the Lib Dem whips from either house is in the room. I can't see any, so Tim, there's absolutely no need to worry about anything you say getting back to them. So go for it.
Oh, fine. Here we go then. /F Farron. Okay. First of all, I absolutely sign up to the need to clear the deficit and to do it by 2018. And I sign up to that not because I want to shrink the state, but because we need to get the country's economy back on a stable footing. And one of the critical dividing lines for ourselves and the Conservatives is that we are not ideologically wedded to a ever smaller state. We are of the view that we need a state that we can afford, but we need to look at the state that we want and we need, and we've got to look forward beyond 2018 to public services that we can sensibly, intelligently, cautiously, but definitely grow. But we've got to get to 2018, and how do we make sort of savings that are going to be seriously acceptable and will make a difference? So just a few ideas. So we can start off with our desire to build 3 million homes over 10 years. It's worth bearing in mind that I'm of the view that the new homes bonus doesn't contribute very much to that at all. It's £3.4 billion. What you could do is you could save that, not spend that money, and replace it by giving local authorities and housing associations the freedom to borrow against the value of their stock, which would be worth several times more than £3.4 billion in terms of actually developing new homes. So you can stick that in the saving column. Let's abolish DCLG. What is the point in DCLG? Does it defend local government? Does it go to the Treasury and argue the case for local councils? No, it doesn't. Let's move the financial function for DCLG straight into the Treasury, and therefore the Local Government Association can have its direct conversations with the Treasury, not through an absolutely supine middleman or middlewoman. And so we get rid of DCLG whatsoever, and you move the equality stuff to the Home Office, and you create a new housing department to replace it. Significantly smaller, but has a seat at the cabinet table. Look at the fact that in many countries around the world, our Foreign Office presence, which is there, is duplicated with a DFID presence. So I believe we should absolutely retain the 0.7 commitment to overseas aid. But I think given that, for example, our presence in Rwanda is mostly DFID, why isn't the Foreign Office just moving into DFID? That's mostly our role there these days. That would be one way of saying a significant amount of money, at least looking at that. How about ending indefinite detention? I haven't got a global figure, but I can tell you that we save £40,000 for every person we don't detain, and you can offset that by £5,000 that you spend on decent, secure, smart tagging if you wanted to do that instead. So you could then actually start looking, and I'm not going to put a number out of the air now, but I can tell you per unit, per individual, it's £40,000 per person, or 35,000 net across the justice system. We make a safe and reasonable assessment across our network, our system, to see what number of people could be taken out of that level of expenditure. Many arguments in terms of how much more valuable, useful, decent, honourable and productive restorative justice would be in any event, and significantly cheaper. Government advertising, vast amounts of government advertising is completely and utterly pointless. The government spent £289 million on the Britain is Great campaign externally. I'm not a massively competent linguist, but my understanding is this is an overseas campaign. The Britain is Great play on words only works in about 2 or 3 languages. It's completely and utterly irrelevant and confusing in others. What a total and utter waste of money. 600 million marketing right to buy. I'm not entirely sure that we need to do that, because I think we should be putting a lid on right to buy. Obviously, there's various things. We can look at the winter fuel payments. We can look at all the things that the party's been talking about in terms of stopping wealthy pensioner benefits. That would talk about 200 million. We know that in the manifesto, we are expecting in the manifesto that we'll be looking at potential tax evasion, tax avoidance, prevention measures, bringing in an extra 5 billion. £29 billion we spend on in-work benefits. Now then, just enacting the living wage would cost the Exchequer 1.3 billion in additional wages for public sector workers, and it would net the Exchequer 3.6 billion in higher taxes and reduced payments of welfare to people in work. And that's a modest Conservative thing you could do. If you really wanted to, we could go much beyond what we're talking about in terms of living wage, and we could eradicate a vast amount of the in-work benefits. You'd have to recycle a proportion of that, or you should recycle a proportion of that, perhaps a quarter, to help smaller businesses, smaller to medium-sized businesses, to be subsidised to do that, so you don't have a great calamity overnight, but you could actually shift away from a situation where basically we are subsidising too many employers to pay their staff poverty wages. Be a positive way of doing that. So married couple tax allowance, £600 million. Scrap the police commissioners, £50 million. And all of these things are really, you can add all this together, and I haven't got a global sum, but somebody's probably doing a running total, and we'll see whether we get anywhere near it. What I want to just finally say is this. Getting to the deficit, if all we are about, clearing the deficit is vital and we must do it. But if all we're about is clearing the deficit, that is staggeringly unambitious. And I want us to be in a position where we can say to the British people, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it is a bright light. And it's a day in 2018 when we start thinking, now is the time to the public services that we want and we need. Small government often means weak citizens. Big government, for the sake of it, is foolish, stupid. That's what Labour would do. It costs vast amounts of money. We'll end up in this mess again. But having the kind of state that we want and we choose, once we've got out of necessary austerity that we have not chosen but has been forced upon us, is something that motivates me.
Thank you, Tim. There's some clipboards going around where you can sign up so that Liberal Reform can send you some fascinating emails. They have a tendency to get stuck when you become so enthralled by the speaker. So I just make sure they continue to flow among you. Right, our last but by no means least speaker is Kishwer.
Thank you very much. I really wonder if you put us on a spectrum of right and left, then I should be right next to Tom Papworth. Because Julie and Tim have come from the one big issue about the living wage, have really spoken about small beer. I don't think we're here to talk about small beer. You know, it is doing foreign affairs gives me the advantage of looking at countries in the round. And frankly, what you've seen over the last 5 years in terms of austerity is nothing like what other European countries, and in fact other countries across the world, have had to do at some point in the cycle, including Latin American countries who have their cycle 10 years before us and so on. Japan, one could go on and on. Even China is beginning to feel the pinch. So what we're talking about in terms of the broad figures that Tom told you about is absolutely right, and we've got a huge task in our hand. Now, if every single party in the political spectrum decides to ring-fence its favourite bit, then you've got essentially a dozen departments that take all the cuts. So we've done overseas aid, which incidentally I have to be with Tom, I don't particularly agree with that. It's not a very efficient way of spending money. But we've also got education, we've got pensions, the triple lock, and all of that. Labour's got their own favourite departments, and you're going to end up with a series of spending figures where the remaining departments will have to make savage year-on-year cuts of around 11%. So if you take, for example, a government department, a very small one, somebody mentioned Department of Culture, Media and Sport, their grant in aid is relatively small. Let's say, I can't remember the exact figure, but their budget is,
6
I
billion.
want to give you the analogy actually of
6 billion.
6 billion. You talked about the arts, you reminded me, you talked about the arts. The British Library has a grant in aid of 100 million. If you take 10% year on year, by the end of this parliamentary cycle, it's not going to be able to do any of the stuff the National Resource Library is meant to do. So it's all very well to say you've got to keep the burden of cuts on the non-ring-fenced departments, but it ain't going to work. But I think almost everybody mentioned the importance of DWP having to bear the bulk of the cuts. And indeed, and I can say to you, I'm a director of one of the large housing associations in the UK. A housing benefit of its own costs us about 24 billion. And why do we pay? And actually, a lot of it is going to private landlords. It's going to the private rental sector. Why are we subsidizing business? So business doesn't pay workers enough, so they need all of these in-work benefits. It's a nutty way of transferring money from one group of taxpayers into the state and out to another group of people through a huge subsidy to business. And it's actually morally indefensible, so I'm completely with you, Tim, on that. If you want to help people right at the bottom, there are very direct and more efficient ways of doing that. So I would definitely not just move to the living wage, but put in a minimum wage that is actually realistic with the transitional help that Tim talked about for smaller businesses as they make the change over the 5 years. To paying people what people should be worth. People ought to, the dignity of working is meaningless if you're not earning enough to feed your wife and kids or pay your rent. So that's a big one for me. But there are a couple of other things, and I'm only going to really bother with big ticket items. You take universal child benefit. We lost it in this last round, my family. But actually, why do we need universal child benefit? One of the things that gets the male very excited about universal child benefit is the fact that it's paid outside the UK to people whose children don't even live in the UK. One of the reasons we have to do that, and by the way, there's another benefit that's paid to people who don't live in the UK, winter fuel allowance, which is dependent, or one of those winter fuel allowances, I'm not sure which one it is, which triggers in when you have exceptionally cold weather in the United Kingdom over a certain 2 days or 3 days, is that right? Okay, guess what? Pensioners in Costa Brava get this when the weather is 18% centigrade. Because if it's paid in the UK and if they have lived in the UK, they're entitled to it when they live abroad. So these kind of universal allowances are they're a complete insult to your intelligence. They shouldn't be paid. So if we got rid of universal child benefit, but help children from poorer families by transferring money to them through the other income support mechanisms, focusing on children, we could do that. The saving there is nearly 5 billion. And another thing you could do with housing is that it seems to me, again, I'm a bit of a proponent of nudge. If you guys know what nudge is, Susskind, etc., of nudge theory. I think the idea that we pick up council tax, housing benefit and stuff for people who earn below a certain threshold acts as a real disincentive to value what you have and to value the stuff. I mean, my housing association builds really top-end properties, and it's painful to see the lack of value of this thing. And I think if we were just able to make people pay a small amount of their rent and then contribute the rest of the benefit. I mean, the IFS recommends 10%. I don't know if 10% is perhaps too high, but something between 5 and 10%. The symbolic significance, I think, of being able to contribute to your own welfare and well-being, and the most important part of that, of course, is housing, seems to me terribly important. And then we come to pensions. That's going to be my last point. Pensions, we all know that pensioners are the most indulged section of society in this country. And I think we would all agree that in terms of the intergenerational compact, it is indefensible again. It is completely indefensible. We brought in a triple lock. I didn't agree with it then. I don't agree with it now. And the idea that we subsidize pensioners even more. I mean, one of the outrageous things this government has just done is to say that they will give 20%, no, the bond, you guys are all saving into. Lots of you in this room must be saving into. I'm not there yet. I wasn't old enough to be able to do it. But we've got to address pension benefits, and we've got to reduce the incentives, as Tom said. One of the incentives, actually, that I think we really want to see is a reduction in the higher income people who are paying into pension pots, getting the enormously generous level of subsidy that people who have far lower incomes who are paying into pension pots are getting. I will end, I'm afraid, slightly controversially, on the Lib Dem policy of building 3 million homes. It ain't deliverable. There isn't the capacity in the country. We're recruiting bricklayers from foreign countries at the moment, and bricklaying, if you followed what Churchill was doing, doesn't seem to be something that needs a huge amount of expertise. We haven't got. Well, Churchill could do it on a fine line, in a straight line, then I suggest just can. But the idea that we can upscale, at the moment we're building 150,000 homes. Before the financial crash, we got up to around 220,000. Huge numbers of construction companies went bust, particularly small family-owned firms. Those skills are gone. We're needing to import in the skills. And it's easy to say, well, we'll bring in more Romanians, Bulgarians, Poles, and so on. If you're bringing in people to build your houses for you at that scale, Tim, you've got to house them. You've got to feed them. You've got to give them the NHS. You've got to give their kids education. So the pressure that you get on all the public services that exists because of the demographic change at the moment, the rise in our population, schools with bursting classrooms and all that, would only augment if you're importing the skills to do that. So it may be something that would be deliverable with targeted incremental measures to support it over a 10-year period, rise of apprenticeships and all of that stuff. But the idea that we can deliver that now is, I'm afraid, just not going to work. So on that point, I think I better sit down and we'll take questions.
Thank you, Kishwer. We've got just under half an hour, so I'll take groups of 3 questions. The quicker the questions, the more we can have, and then our panelists will respond. So, lady there and here. With no microphones, I'm afraid, so just speak up. You can introduce yourself as well when you. Yep.
Yes. I know you're going to ask questions at the conference. Hi, I'm Matt Seven, West London, Lonsdale, and also BBC for Morecambe. I've got to say, if you think that bricklaying is an unskilled job, I'm not sure if I'd ever want to rent one of your houses. I've seen Churchill's wall, it's shit. I've got a serious one, which is I completely endorse the protection of of pensions as being a bad thing. I think that the way that the cuts are loaded up on the young and on the lowest paid is absolutely wrong. And to subsidise, things like housing benefit being paid to private sector landlords, that's wrong. I'd almost go as far as to say I would abolish private sector landlords, actually. I think housing associations do it a lot better. I would absolutely endorse the idea of scrapping things like universal fuel payments, free TV licence, all of that should be out the window. Except for those who are really are very poorest. And also, just as a slightly controversial one, I wonder if the problem is not the size of the state spending, but just the state's too physically big. So why don't we cut Northern Ireland?
Thank you. There was a lady, yes.
Can I first comment?
What's your name, sorry?
Sorry, Catherine Smart, Cambridge. Can I first comment on the business about bricklayers? I'm not worried about factory builds, but I am quite sure we could, if we skill up quickly, we can do factory build, and I'm not, prefab is the old one, but they were very snug, and factory build would do it much quicker.
Yep.
That's the first point. Second point I wanted to make was, seeing as I am a pensioner, I rather like the triple lock.
I bet you do.
But I agree that all the ancillary benefits should be looked at, and they should all be taxed.
Yes.
Every single one of them. And thirdly, what about Trident? Nobody mentioned Trident.
My name is Stanley Grossman. I'm in Camden. And I have one small comment on what Tim said about cutting back on detention to save some money. If you simply did the Lib Dem policy and legalized some drugs, you'd save zillions of pounds on prisoners. It costs a lot more to keep a person in prison. However, I'd like to question the whole fundamental premise of this meeting. And that is, there was a lot of economic thought that a deficit is not a bad thing. There was a BBC program the other day pointing out that when governments have balanced budgets, it was followed almost immediately by recession. That quantitative easing saved the economy in the U.S. and the UK. It did not do anything in Spain because Spain didn't have a central bank, couldn't print euros, and then they're screwed. And there's an argument that the whole premise that the deficits go to your children, it's not like an individual. If I borrow £100,000 and I can't pay it back, I'm in trouble. If the government borrows £100,000, it just prints it. And
Can you wrap up?
And inflation doesn't necessarily follow. When we're printing money, we have the lowest inflation ever. So the whole principle that we have to balance the budget, it certainly should be questioned.
Okay, thank you. I don't think it'd be a Lib Dem Fringe event without somebody questioning the premise of your event. We'll go in the same order partly because I probably can't hold Tom back from responding to that last point about that running a deficit is a good thing.
Actually, I was going to talk about bricklayers.
Please don't.
We managed to build 400,000 houses a year in the 1950s. It can be done. We're not going to get there overnight. But bearing in mind the huge political challenges of reforming the planning regulations, it is worth bearing in mind that if you do it in pretty much day one of a parliament, by the 5th year of that parliament, you will have seen the uptick in growth and the uptick in jobs. That means the government will probably end up getting the credit for it. And the thing about those bricklaying jobs is they are semi-skilled and skilled labour, but they're also semi-skilled and skilled labour that's brilliantly appropriate for the hundreds of thousands of people who are currently on the unemployment roll, who didn't do very well at school and are never going to thrive in the knowledge economy. Construction jobs are perfect for these people. We would be taking the people who are struggling most to get jobs and providing the very work they need that then helps us build the houses that we need, thus bringing rental costs down, thus doing away with all that housing benefit expense. It's just a win-win, this one. I mean, I just can't understand why we don't do it. Stan, I'm not going to pick you up on the point about the deficit. I'm going to pick you up on the point about drugs. It's 10 billion a year. We spend 10 billion a year on the war on drugs, and guess what? We're losing.
Thank you, Tom. Julie.
Catherine, no, I didn't mention Trident. It is more than my life is worth to mention Trident, because if we reopen that question, somebody somewhere is probably going to say, Julie, it's another working group on defence or on Trident. Here's a job for you. So please, I don't want to reopen that at all. And the cost of it is going to be stuck into the defence budget. So it's actually not going to be coming out of the Treasury. So yes, it has to be paid for, but if we've stuck with some sort of NATO commitments on defence spending, then Trident will get lost in that expenditure. But I suspect that at some point, come the autumn conference, the whole issue will have been reopened again. I think we're probably all in agreement about either removing or taxing the benefits for pensioners, particularly on higher incomes, who are paying tax or at a higher rate. Legalising drugs and saving zillions, yes, please let's do that. I'm not going to get into bricklaying. It's not something I've tried. And I am quite sure, however, that it does require certain skills, and I wouldn't like to undermine bricklayers, plumbers, or anybody else that's going to ensure that our infrastructure is safe and secure.
Thank you, Julie. I might now start finding anybody who mentions bricklayers again. Tim.
All right, okay. So obviously in Western Lonsdale we encourage people to think the unthinkable, including, giving away large chunks of the country. So including bits that you can actually see from some of our mountains. But anyway, so interesting idea. I don't think I'd like that. But obviously the notion of taxing pensioner benefits makes complete sense. Removing them for the wealthy and taxing them otherwise. I mean, we haven't talked about Trident, any of us in our first round of comments, but obviously we are supportive, at least, of reducing the spend on Trident. Begs the question that, would there have been a possibility, might there still be a possibility, of a nuclear deterrent that is not Trident and is significantly cheaper? I would love to think so still. But that is essentially capital spend. It's not year-on-year revenue spend by and large. It's probably why we didn't mention it so much. On housing, it's 3 million houses over 10 years, 300,000 a year, which is ambitious, but it's not 3 million over 3 years. And you've got to think of some ways of getting that started. We do not have the skills to build those houses now, and they are really skilled jobs. But we have the skills to make a start, and generally speaking, the market of skills will, even if there's a couple of year time lag, catch up with demand that is out there for those skills. And our apprenticeship schemes is a wonderful way of making sure that demand can be met pretty quickly. And what you do, as I suggested in my opening remarks, is if you give, in particular, housing associations the right not just to borrow against the value of their stock, but the right to cross-subsidise or building houses that are affordable, but also some that aren't affordable. You build mixed-up estates to start off with, and therefore cover a lot of the costs. You can probably get to 50, 60, 70,000 a year just from that. Housing associations should be the vanguard of any new housing revolution, and I believe the market can and should and probably will follow. Stan's comment, I've got some time for that. I think the notion that we shouldn't be religious about our belief that we've got to eliminate the deficit and national debt and all the rest of it. But I think, so we come to fixate on that. But having said that, why do we need to get rid of the deficit? It is principally because of what it does to confidence in the UK economy. And having failed, if we had failed to make decent steps towards eliminating the deficit and don't continue to do that, then you run a significant risk of interest rates going up massively, and we're in a situation where there is a recovery, but it is absolutely precarious. And if you think that 1% on interest rates is worth £100 a month to the average householder in this country, if you have a 3-4% increase in interest rates, just think of the mass unemployment, the mass house repossessions you get in a marginal recovery like this. So that is the reason why we should clear the deficit. In and of itself, you can live with debt.
Kishwer?
Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, I mean, of course, Lib Dem plans are to run a current budget surplus, but after adjusting for the economic cycle. And I think that's actually quite a critical point, because obviously when you have growth, you have higher receipts than you do when you don't, when you're in a recession or in a downturn. So that's an important point. I think Trident, I would just say that I my views are well known from previous conferences, that I believe that the state's principal task is the security and territorial integrity of its land and citizens. The other way around, probably citizens and then land. But so I think that if you were a Ukrainian today, you might reflect on having given up nuclear weapons on the back of a guarantee given by the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians. And you might reflect as whether you would have lost a huge chunk of your land, a very critical and important chunk of your land, Crimea, if you had still had nuclear weapons. So I'm afraid when I look around the world and see how unstable it is, and I see how much the Chinese and Russians are spending in real terms, I'm not one for diminishing our capabilities. And anyway, the replacement of Trident, the revenue benefits would not come in for another 30 years, by which time there are several of us in this room who may not be around to see those benefits. So, and 40 years, I mean, the Independent Trident Review said very clearly that you could not project what the world would look like in 2070. And that was the basis for using, in this sense, what I would call the precautionary principle, and not, therefore, disengaging when you can't predict what's going to happen in 2027, never mind 2070. So that's Trident, but let me continue on my theme of provoking you by saying that nobody has mentioned the one dinosaur in the room, which is the NHS. And maybe we've been frightened to mention it looking around some of your ages here. And the fact that you might be active users of this service. But as far as I'm concerned, in for a penny, in for a pound. I've allowed myself to be vilified, so I might as well continue. The NHS, we can't continue with the demographics of this room alone. We and an increase, by the way, in the population rate, which will feed through. We cannot continue to have a universal service, free at the time of delivery, absolutely universal, elective and non-elective, emergency and non-emergency, and a drugs budget, which is under the most extraordinary pressure in terms of technological change, scientific delivery, and better stuff coming down the road. And by the way, let me say to you, we are the only purchaser in the world, the NHS, which Big Pharma has by the short and curlies. Big Pharma has far better negotiation capabilities with health services in other countries of the world because they're not so generous. We are caught by the pharmaceutical industry because they know that they can bargain with us and all they need to do is go to the media and say that cancer drug is better than that cancer drug, and the NICE is denying it, or the Cancer Drugs Fund is denying it, and life becomes miserable for the constituency MP, whoever it is, who happens to have people who need that drug. So we're going to have to move, folks, if not in your time, then in your children's time. We're going to have to move to co-payments. And we will have to move to co-payments probably for elective stuff first, probably for in small numbers, in small amounts, first number of visits to a GP, of course, means-tested visits to a GP, so those who can afford, needing to pay perhaps a tenner, and then upscaling from there. But that is the future. But that has to come alongside a rehashing, alongside Dilnot lines, of what Dilnot was proposing for end-of-life care, where he's trying to re-establish, Steve Webb is trying to re-establish the insurance market to allow us to buy cheaper products to insure against that, should we not have the money. That's what we'll have to do alongside the health service. If you want to bring in co-payments, you've got to have a better insurance market for able to buy affordable insurance to cover those contingencies.
Thank you, Kishwer.
Just very briefly, for those of you interested in a cheaper version, nuclear deterrent to replace Trident, I would highly commend our most recent publication, Retiring Trident.
Toby's
left.
Yeah, I know, and Toby's done, and the author's just left a moment ago.
Can't get it signed. Three more quick questions, if we can. One, chat at the back. Any ladies? No. Bill and Paul. Yeah. Name first, please.
But speaking on the issue of drugs, legalisation of drugs, yes, I think in the long term it would save a lot of money on policing, on kind of restricting the flow of drugs, and also quite good tax to high heaven. But I think first you've got to control the supply of drugs before, you've got to control the way they're produced, because at the moment we are, criminal gangs are still controlling it. Until we actually control that supply, we can't then legalise it, because it will still be in the hands of criminal gangs. We can't then turn around and say, yes, let's legalise it, but then the issue people to stop, we wouldn't
So, government cannabis farms, I think, was the short version of that.
The panel have come up with most of my pet ideas already, so I'll just come up with a couple of others. When I was a county councillor, a long time ago now, I was a district councillor at the same time, Labour had introduced such a labyrinthine, process-driven system that it actually made your statutory requirements became extremely expensive. So I would allow councils to do well what they wanted. And reduce the and the government support should simply be the equalisation, so the councils raise their own money, except the wealthy areas to the poorer areas, a transfer. So just take the rules away, just let them do what they want and stand or fall by the democratic process. Also, the second point is that Julie mentioned only in one word, which was procurement. Kishwer did allude to it as well. Government and government departments and councils and everybody else are very, very poor at getting the best prices across the board, whether it's railway, procurement or whatever. They are useless at getting good deals compared with the private sector. So we need to do something about procurement.
Thank you very much. Paul, briefly possible.
Yeah. I want to say something about the sort of universal benefits versus safety net question. Because it seems to me, always puzzled me, the amount of time and effort and legislation and party policy time spent on welfare and fine-tuning welfare payments compared to the amount of effort and time and money and policy work spent on making sure that fewer and fewer people need the benefits in the first place. It's utterly lamentable. But in the United Kingdom, people on low-paid jobs, 20% of them have degrees. At the same time, we have unemployment, and at the same time, we have underemployment. I mean, it's just utterly preposterous, and it's just our own policy processes. And I think that one of the difficulties is that if you believe Gordon Brown is a great champion, or was a great champion of universal benefits, everybody getting something from the state in some way, goes against the whole idea that what the state should be doing is helping people to get to a position where they don't need the benefits in the first place. And it's not a crime to think that way.
Thank you, Paul. We'll go in reverse order if you want to start. We've got 5 minutes left, so.
Well, I completely agree with what Paul said, so I need not take up any more time.
Unless you want to make any closing remarks.
My closing remarks. Yes, I mean, I think it is one of the tragedies of our electoral system that if you talk to people, I speak to people who are new Labour, I speak to people who are old Labour, I speak to Conservatives. If you talk to people, everybody agrees what the problems are. Everybody can see them. You know, whether it's end-of-life care, whether the NHS budget, whether it's need to spend on defence or whatever it is, or the capacity of government departments to be able to absorb the cuts that are happening, so on. Infrastructure, everybody agrees. The things the parties agree when you speak to them without a public space is that the NHS can't go on, that we are falling behind, or we can't let ourselves fall behind in terms of skills, education, the knowledge economy, because as the East rises, the West has to maintain a competitive edge, and we need to upskill to maintain that competitive edge, particularly in terms of research and innovation. And everybody agrees that somehow we've got to do something about the intergenerational compact, whether it's housing or anything else. We can't put all the burden on our young people. We all agree this. Why cannot we establish a forum maybe perhaps not across the board because we've got to be distinctive, but just in one area, the NHS. Why can't we establish a royal commission on future funding of the NHS and get all the main parties to agree its outcomes and have a pact that we will not use the NHS as a political football in the next election on that basis? I think that's my
Thank you, Kishwer.
closing comment.
Okay, NHS actually co-payment just for a second. I mean, I think I absolutely do not buy the inevitability or the need for co-payment, and I'll tell you why. Because if the issue is growth in the cost of health services, then co-payment is not the answer. We're basically saying that we are enshrining ever-widening health inequalities if we do that. What we're saying is that in a sense, we're paying for our healthcare now. We just pay it through taxes. We go through co-payment, then we're saying we're paying it partly through taxes and partly through allowing wealthier people to buy a better health service. And that isn't right. That's morally wrong. That's not what the NHS is for. I'm not, however, for treating it like a sacred cow, and we can't reform it. We should sometimes think about absolutely doing that. Universal benefit, I mean, obviously there's an argument, there always was an argument from Beveridge's day onwards, that part of the argument for universal benefits is about making sure there is nationwide consent for the welfare society and for the welfare state. And if you take away all benefits that are available to people who are not just the poorest people, then you undermine consent. And that's when you start to build an underclass. But actually the point is, and I made it, and Kishwer's made it, everybody's made it, and it's been made it by Paul, that you have it's a ludicrous situation that we are subsidising employers and landlords to pay to either to pay people shocking wages or charge unacceptable rents and low quality housing. This is, could be said for the common agricultural policy or any other broken market where you are subsidising the fact that a market is broken. We've got to try and make sure those markets work, and that's where legislation on living wage, for example, could absolutely help us. And sometimes we just got to realise that free markets do not always work. And we accept that is why we have a welfare state, is because the free market does not always act in a way which is in itself free. As Keynes said, the market can remain illogical for longer than you can remain solvent, and that applies to the majority of people and businesses in this country. And finally, we still have to make tough choices. We're going to have to make really tough choices in the next 3 years if we're part of government, and even if there's a constructive opposition, we'll have to make tough choices as well. And what would be terrible, wouldn't it, if the lesson learned by SNP, by Labour, Tories, everybody else out there, was that then the Liberal Democrats acting responsibly, maturely, in the national interest in 2010 led to the Liberal Democrats doing terribly badly electorally. What incentive is there for any other party to behave in a mature way in the national interest? And that would be terrible if the lesson learned. This is the plea to the electorate to give us our fair dues in this coming election. If the lesson out there is that acting wisely, maturely in the national interest ruins you electorally, what incentive is there ever for any government in the future to behave in that mature way?
We're cracking that, so 30 seconds each if you can leave it on.
Right. Improving procurement, as Phil said, absolutely. We need to find better mechanisms for doing that, including in the health service. I'm not quite sure I make the health service a sacred cow, but I do think it is hugely important that it remains free at the point of need. And I am fairly allergic to the idea of means-tested benefits for certain things. So I think we need to think through what benefits are there. But Paul's idea, why don't we actually look, once we've got the manifesto out of the way, look at ways of raising people's standard of living so they're not needing to be in the benefit system. So something for us to look at as a party post-election.
Very quickly, Jack, we don't need to control supply. The government doesn't control supply of alcohol or tobacco. We probably need to regulate quality. But we can get our joints from British American Tobacco. We can get our ecstasy from GlaxoSmithKline, and we can get our heroin directly from Afghan farmers, which means they would strip away their support for the Taliban. The reason. Indeed. The reason we need to move to co-payment in the NHS is not to raise money, it's to control demand. If the price of something is zero, the demand is infinite. And at the moment, where people are queuing up to consume that free product. On universal benefits, can we all turn the recording devices off for a second? I think the Greens might be onto something with the citizens' income. I think it should at least be examined. Probably better not let Natalie Bennett present it, but I do. There is a certain logic to it. And finally, I'm going to wrap up by actually addressing Stan's. Is he gone? Stan's point on the hello, Stan. Stan's point on the deficit. Why we need to eliminate deficit? The interest payments on our debt are currently higher than our entire education spending. If we don't eliminate the deficit, at some point, the interest payments are going to be higher than our entire health budget. And sometime down the road, and it's about due, because they come every 10 years, we're going to have another economic crisis. And the government's going to need to go back into deficit again to be able to keep the automatic stabilisers working and be able to fund the next recovery. If we haven't got out of this deficit, we're not going to have the room to deal with the next crisis. So we absolutely have to eliminate the deficit, and I hope we've made a good start today.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for coming. If you want to join the Liberal Reform Board for drinks, the jury's in after this, you're very welcome. But please join me in thanking our panel.